If any of you grew up on the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes, you might be wondering whether it is a coincidence that our philosophical figure for today shares a name with good old Calvin's stuffed tiger. It is not a coincidence. Indeed, Hobbes the cartoon tiger was named after Hobbes the philosopher. Now I have known both Hobbeses for a long time. However, I have yet to figure out exactly how these two figures are similar, why one is named after the other. Perhaps Bill Watterson, the creator of Calvin and Hobbes, simply didn't understand philosophy all that well. Or perhaps the name isn't really supposed to imply similar philosophical views, but rather similar senses of humor or similarly striped skin. Or perhaps I'm missing something altogether. This latter possibility is certainly more than possible, and if it is true that I am just not seeing the overt similarity between historical and cartoon Hobbes, then I hope someone will enlighten me. I would be forever grateful, as this is in fact the sort of question that keeps me awake at night. This plea thus posed, let's turn to Hobbes, the philosopher that is, not the tiger. Hobbes's ideas find their base on a certain assumption. Namely, they rest on the basic assumption that psychological egoism is true. Now, psychological egoism is a mouthful of a term, but is actually pretty simple to understand. Namely, psychological egoism says that people's actions are motivated solely by their self-interest. Now, such a thesis could take several forms, and it's important for us to figure out exactly what Hobbes meant by it. For Hobbes, being motivated to act solely by self-interest involves two things. First, it means that we do things when we want them, or to use Hobbes's terms, when we have an appetite for them. So, for instance, if I want to spend the day reading Calvin and Hobbes, then I do so. Second, being motivated to act solely by self-interest means that we will avoid doing things that we detest, or to use Hobbes' term again, those things we have an aversion to. For instance, if I see that the sidewalk is icy up ahead and don't want to slip on it, I will likely change my course. So then, Hobbes' psychological egoism comes down to the rather simple observation that when people do things, it is always either for the sake of getting something they want, or avoiding something they don't want. The problem with this, Hobbes continues, is that it inevitably leads to conflict. Indeed, if there's only one psychological egoist around, everything is fine. She can simply take what she wants and avoid what she doesn't. But the thing is, there isn't just one psychological egoist. There's a whole world full of us. Every human is equally a psychological egoist. There are at least three ways, Hobbes point out, that this can lead to trouble. First, since there are limited resources in the world, it can happen that two people end up wanting the same thing. This brings them into conflict. For instance, if my buddy Biff and I both want the last slice of pizza, we can't have it. And so we enter into conflict. The second way that psychological egoists come into conflict is through our desire to protect ourselves and our property. Imagine, for instance, that you and I are neighbors. Now I know that you might want to take my land. It's beautiful. Therefore, I come over to your place on the pretense of stopping by for a cup of sugar, and instead make you my slave, so as to protect my property. Such an action would clearly cause some conflict. The third way in which psychological egoists living in the same place is bound to cause problems is that one of the things we as humans want is glory. The problem with glory, however, is that not everyone can have it. It's part of the very definition of glory. Having a blue ribbon wouldn't mean anything if everyone in the race received one. Therefore, a common desire for glory inevitably produces conflict. So then, Hobbes continues, since humans are psychological egoists, we naturally are going to wind up literally at each other's throats, in conflicts arising from competitions, power grabs, and the pursuit of glory. To put it differently, our natural state as psychological egoists, our state of nature, is a state of war, one in which everyone is everyone else's enemy. Under such conditions, there is no such thing as friendship, no time for building industries, no motivation for creating art. The individual's life in such a state would unavoidably be, to use Hobbes' infamous formulation, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. This, then, is the natural way of human existence. However, Hobbes continues, in what is inarguably an ingenious move, this natural state is not at all desirable. Indeed, who would want to live in a short life devoid of friendship and things like art? But since humans are psychological egoists motivated only by self-interest, and since we are not at all interested in the natural state of human life, we are motivated to avoid the very thing that is natural to us as humans. We are motivated to avoid the state of nature. So how do we do this? Well, it's rather obvious that if we are to avoid the warmongering that is the state of nature, we need to make peace. Peace, of course, means putting an end to the conflict of interest that arises from our psychological egoism. These conflicts are avoided, Hobbes proposes, only when we stop thinking about our own interests exclusively and start thinking about the interests of others as well. The best way to determine these interests, in turn, is by asking ourselves how we would want to be treated, and then treating others in this manner. To put it simply, Hobbes feels that the best way to put an end to our conflict of interest, and so attain peace, is to live by the golden rule. However, Hobbes points out, this isn't going to work if just one guy on the block starts living by the golden rule. Indeed, if we are living in a state of nature, warring with everyone we meet and conflicting based on our interests, and in this state, Jim down the street starts living according to the golden rule, we're all going to say, hey, this Jim guy is being all moral now. Let's rob the weakling. To put it differently and less dramatically, if we are to attain peace and so avoid the state of nature, all the members of a certain group must agree to live according to the golden rule. Such an agreement is what Hobbes terms a contract. What this means then is that for Hobbes, ethics is not something that is natural to humans, very much the opposite. Indeed, ethics is what we come up with to avoid our natural state, the state of nature. In our natural state, there is no morality. Right and wrong simply do not make sense, because the only rule is get what you can and keep it as long as you can. It's thus only when, out of self-interest, we come up with a contract to live according to the golden rule that right and wrong, just and unjust, and morality itself come into existence. But because ethics is not natural to humans, Hobbes continues, there is a potential problem with setting it up. Namely, because humans are first and foremost motivated to act out of self-interest, it would be perfectly natural for a human to enter into a moral contract, promise everyone they're going to live according to the golden rule, and then not do it. For instance, you could promise everyone you're not going to take their land, and then as soon as they let their guard down, take it anyway. This would be a way to have your cake and eat it too. Indeed, it would allow you to avoid the brutal state of nature and get what you wanted in the first place. Because of this difficulty, then, people are going to naturally be hesitant to enter into any sort of moral contract. To put it differently, since humans are psychological egoists, they need some reason that makes it in their self-interest to adhere to the moral contract after they have set it up. The best way to give such a reason, Hobbes argues, is via enforcement by a third party. In other words, the only way people are going to be moral and so honor their contract with each other is to have someone standing over and above them with the promise of punishment if the contract is broken. By way of analogy, think about the only way second graders are going to treat each other with decency. You need a teacher in the room who holds the threat of potential punishment. Who then is the equivalent for society? Who threatens all members of society with punishment in the same way the teacher threatens second graders? Clearly, this is the government. Indeed, the government stands over and above the members of society and threatens punishment to anyone who disregards the moral contract set up by the very members of that society. For Hobbes, then, the government is essential if the moral contract set up by people is to avoid the moral contract set up by people to avoid the state of nature is ever to survive. What this means, then, is that for Hobbes, ethics and politics, while both unnatural, are intimately related. Indeed, for Hobbes, both ethics and governments are ultimately created for the sake of avoiding what is natural to humans, and so as to best serve the self-interest of humans. But in order to serve self-interest in this way, both are needed together. Indeed, ethics without government falls apart because there is no reason for anyone to follow it. There is no need for government in the first place, on the other hand, in a society that has not yet made a contract to be ethical. Ethical theory for Hobbes is thus precisely the same thing as political theory. Hobbes, of course, as you probably noticed, is a good 17th century British subject and so believes politics to be best realized in the form of monarchy. Now, Hobbes gives some very good and convincing reasons for why this is so, which, unfortunately, we will not be able to get into today, as our class is not one in political philosophy. However, it would be good, for one, especially if one is convinced by Hobbes's reasoning, to think about whether or not monarchy is the necessary conclusion of his argument, or whether another form of government might best protect the contract set up by its citizens. What all this has to do with the 20th century cartoon drawing of a stuffed tiger, I still can't see. But as I said at the beginning of the lecture, I would be forever indebted to anyone who could show me.